This episode is brought to you by Content Multiplied. It's not a secret anymore that content creation is really important, but very few people talk about the importance of consistency. And I myself have really struggled with that consistency. And for that reason, I looked for a solution, and Content Multiplied was a really good one for me. Since using them, I've been able to focus on what I enjoy the most, which is recording podcasts, while Myla and her team are really taking care of everything else. Whether you have a podcast, you're holding keynote speeches, you're doing a YouTube series, you're writing a blog, a newsletter, a book, the Content Multiplied team can really take whatever you're producing and repurpose it into a series of micro-content, and suddenly you have dozens and dozens of pieces that can be shared for you, and Content Multiplied even takes care of that for you. Unlock your content superpower with Content Multiplied and go to contentmultiplied.com today. That's contentmultiplied.com. Thanks, Myla, and let's go into the show. You are listening to Impact Hustlers, and I am your host, Michael Schaffrath. I have made it my mission to inspire the next generation of entrepreneurs to solve some of the world's biggest social and environmental problems. And for this reason, I am speaking to some of the best entrepreneurs out there who are solving problems such as food waste, climate change, poverty, and homelessness. My goal is that Impact Hustlers will inspire you either by starting an impact business yourself, by joining the team of one, or by taking a small step, whatever that may be, towards being part of the solution to the world's biggest problems. In today's episode, I speak to Neil Malhotra, Stanford Political Economy professor and the director of the Graduate School of Business's Center for Social Innovation. Neil just published a book named Frontiers in Social Innovation with Harvard Business Review Press, and the book serves as a really comprehensive and good guide for both experienced and first-time entrepreneurs, and especially social entrepreneurs, founders that are solving the world's biggest social and environmental problems. It combines a range of insights from researchers and practitioners across impact measurement, but also measurements like design thinking and some of the biggest challenges in social entrepreneurship nowadays. And I'm really excited to have Neil on the show and to share more about the book and your work as well.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a pleasure.
Thanks so much. I was really excited to have you on. I talk obviously to a lot of startup founders, and I think sometimes bridging the gap between different players in society, especially between academia and startup founders, especially in the social impact space, is so important. I really enjoyed reading your book, and obviously not just written by you, but by loads of interesting contributors from Stanford. And I'm really interested in extracting some of the lessons that you share in the book for our listeners today and get them to buy the book and learn more. So maybe before we do that, though, I'd love to jump into your personal journey. So what got you to be a professor at Stanford researching and teaching social innovation? What drives you, and why are you doing what you do?
Sure. So my background is that I'm a political scientist by training, and much of my research centers around the relationship between business and society, business and government, business and politics. And obviously, social innovation and social entrepreneurship are really at the center of those issues as well. How business can improve society and take account of the needs of stakeholders. So I think because of my research background, I was appointed to be director of the Center for Social Innovation at Stanford. And for people that don't know, this is a center whose history doesn't even stretch back to its founding in the 1990s, but really goes back to the 1960s with Dean R.J. Miller, who used to be the president of Ford, but who really was one of the first people to really talk about social responsibility and stakeholder capitalism, very much earlier before those were terms in vogue. And the center has created a lot of thought leadership in this space. It founded the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which is one of the preeminent journals and publications people in the industry read. And directing the curriculum, we had been getting emails, maybe multiple times per month. Someone says, can you help my startup? Like, what can we learn from the Center for Social Innovation? Can you come and give a talk? Can we take coursework? And we just didn't have the scale to meet all of these needs. But I've always been a big believer that education should not be confined to the ivory tower, that ideas should be spread and shared, and that they're goods that should be not proprietary, but open source. And so part of the idea of this book is to share our learnings, because there seemed to be a lot of demand for it, but we didn't have really a mechanism to scale and spread these ideas.
Amazing. I think that's a great way to spread those ideas. So give us a brief summary on kind of some of the key lessons that you're trying to share with the book. What is it that you're trying to get across to entrepreneurs?
Sure. So, I mean, the book has 4 sections, and I think all 4 sections, I think, apply to both seasoned entrepreneurs as well as young students. But the nice thing about the book is that you can kind of pick and choose what sections are most relevant to you. So the first section is really on leadership, and it talks about the unique leadership skills people in the social sector have, which are very distinct from, pure for-profit, market-driven business. And the second section is about impact measurement. And I think this is really important because a lot of sources of capital, like philanthropic foundations, as well as impact investors, this is a key criteria they use to select investments. So figuring out ways to measure impact in your organization is quite important. And then there's other sections basically on kind of educational models for training people and incubating social entrepreneurship. So basically how we teach this at Stanford and what basically getting you under the hood. And then the final section applies the learnings and concepts into specific areas like healthcare, environment, education.
Great. We'll dive deeper into that in a second. One of the thoughts I had when I was preparing to this as well, in your introduction to the book, you write about how far social innovation has come as well, where in the past it was seen to be the thing of governments and NGOs, and kind of business is a separate thing. At best, business may donate to those NGOs a little bit, and that's about it. Obviously, we see this massive shift where there's this movement of impact-driven companies being started, a lot of them collaborating with government, with NGOs, and a lot of more collaboration happening. Obviously, Stanford itself, I'm really keen to understand that a bit. Stanford itself is really at the heart of Silicon Valley, and there's a revolving door between like the tech startup scene and Stanford, and in terms of like for-profit businesses, loads of startups started there. Do you feel like social innovation has what has the role of social innovation been? Has that usually been something that maybe was quite ignored by a lot of people in Silicon Valley for a while, and that has just only recently been picked up more? Like, was the social innovation work always like tucked in the corner somewhere, and now people are slowly like much more interested in that? Can you tell us a bit about the dynamics in Silicon Valley and at Stanford on that topic?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's complicated. So, I mean, the history of Silicon Valley and Stanford are really intertwined. And I think you can't really say what caused what. So did Silicon Valley cause Stanford to be a great university, or did Stanford cause Silicon Valley to be a center? I think they had a mutual relationship. And I don't think the people back then in the 1960s thought of it as social innovation. I think they thought of it as discovery. But if you really think about what has had the great, one of the few businesses or business innovations that has had the greatest impact socially, I mean, the semiconductor, the amount of GDP and well-being it's created through this invention, I don't think there's been anything really, maybe the printing press, there's very select inventions that have done that. But I think if you talk to young people today, they more explicitly want to embed social innovation into their careers. But at the same time, some of them want to be nonprofit leaders, but that's not really how they view it. They view the private sector as the engine for making society a better place. And so they really want to have that stakeholder mentality as they're building their for-profit careers. I would also note that even though I think a lot of your audience is entrepreneurs, I think at Stanford and at the CSI and the book really tries to talk about entrepreneurship as well. So what I mean by that are people who work for large companies, Fortune 500 companies, but try to innovate within those organizations to make social change. And so there's just many examples of that where people have been entrepreneurs. Just a couple of examples, with eBay, a lot of the young people there push them to have better carbon neutrality for their data centers. At Alaska Airlines, one of the young executives pushed them to improve gender equity by allowing new mothers to keep their frequent flyer miles on leave and hold, and their status. So I'm just saying there's a lot of creative ways that people can innovate outside of startups.
I'd love to talk about that in a little bit. I think my personal journey has been interesting because even as a student in school, I was working as a charity fundraiser and worked with different charities throughout my time. I actually studied politics initially and was a lot in that space as well. And I grew really frustrated a lot with the state of politics and also charities in terms of bringing about change. And I was probably guilty of going to the other extreme, from thinking, okay, charities are the way to go, to thinking, nobody needs charities anymore. We have now social entrepreneurs, and who cares about charities and governments? Like, it's going to be the entrepreneurs that make the change. Do you think that's happening at the moment, or do you think there's a need to argue for another way of collaboration between those different parties?
Well, I just think those extreme views are just not correct. And some of the chapters in the book speak about this. So, for example, nonprofits, I think, and foundations are still going to be a major power player in this space, partly because of all of the preferential tax treatment they have in certain economies, the United States, but also in other countries as well. And the fact that a lot of wealth is concentrated in these foundations, and so they still are the gatekeepers. I just think that things like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and things like that are still going to be driving a lot of what happens in social innovation. And you just look at, for example, the Bezos family, both parts of that family, the money. And I would also say on the government front, there's a chapter that explains it's very hard to scale social innovation. So unlike a lot of pure for-profit, which you have sort of this exponential growth and scaling, a lot of social innovations are very difficult because of the nature of the product and service, the customer base, to really scale. And so governments are oftentimes really a mechanism to scale and to have those public-private partnerships. So I think kind of the view that, we don't need nonprofits, foundations, governments anymore, everything can be done with entrepreneurship, is probably not realistic.
I was expecting you to say that, obviously, and I do believe that as well. I think it was just something. I think even I saw the quote of Chris Sacca the other day on Twitter, where he posted something along those lines, like, government's not going to get it done, NGOs not going to get it done, let's fund the entrepreneurs to solve all these problems. And I mean, there's some truth to it, but I think the answer is collaboration between those parties. So absolutely agree with that. Let's move a little bit into another theme of the book, which is impact measurement, and make it really practical for entrepreneurs. You talk about, obviously, how there's like this whole range of impact measurement from the pure academic way of doing it, randomized control trials, the scientific method, really applying diligently the scientific method to how you measure your impact. And then there is startups that apply it in a very lean way. And most startups are reliant on applying impact measurement in a very, very lean way. Then there's methods like I mentioned before, I recorded an episode with Sir Ronald Cohen. He's advocating a lot for impact-weighted accounts, which is being developed at Harvard, which is obviously another method, but also requires quite a lot of effort to actually pull this off. So what is it that you can recommend to early stage entrepreneurs that want to have a good, solid, non-greenwashing way of measuring their impact? What would you recommend to them in terms of lessons that they can take when they build a startup?
That's a great question, and it's very complicated, so just bear with me. There's several chapters in the book that speak to this, including impact-weighted accounting. I think one kind of thing the book really argues is having a good theory of change is a really good starting point, because unless you really know the differences between your outcomes and outputs, what your key performance indicators are, what are you actually measuring? So an example is like in the ed tech space, you could claim you're having a big impact because a lot of students are using their product or a lot of students are spending a lot of time on it, but that actually doesn't mean you're educating them. So what is the right impact metric in that space? Is it test scores? Some people criticize those. But I think kind of critically thinking what are the key metrics that actually speak to your theory of change is very key. Now, on the point about randomized controlled trials, I actually think personally it's quite overblown how expensive they are. And I actually think it is a tool that early stage entrepreneurs can use that does not necessarily mean you move automatically to a lean data approach. And so what do I mean by that? So I think a lot of times entrepreneurs get very kind of scared because they see these very like famous people like JPal or things like that spending millions of dollars on these RCTs, and they say, oh, I don't have 7 figures to spend on this. Well, to be honest, any time you have any resource constraint so that your product or service cannot be rolled out to everybody, well, one way is to randomly allocate, and then you've kind of naturally created that data that's embedded in your organization. In terms of analyzing the data, there's many academics that will analyze your data for free as long as they can publish a paper out of it. So there's basically a whole army of free consultants available to early stage startups. Just an example, I collaborated with a very early stage startup that was trying to improve healthy eating and less meat consumption. And we basically very easily was able to embed an RCT in what they were already doing. And then I think there's a lot of other impact measurement techniques which rely on data that the company's already collected. So an example is Teach for America. They've done expensive RCTs, but they've also done studies where they have data they've already collected and used, for example, arbitrary cutoffs to approximate random assignment and gotten very similar results that you would get out of an RCT. So I would just encourage people, don't be intimidated. Don't immediately go to lean approaches. That a lot of these more rigorous approaches are in the hands in your toolkit that you might not realize.
And what would you suggest to actually make it happen? Do you suggest startups to seek an academic partner to conduct those? How should entrepreneurs go about this practically?
I mean, I think that's probably the easiest thing to do. And if you just try to Google search who's working on your topic. So if you actually have a social mission. So is your mission to increase healthy eating, reduce diabetes? Is it to improve education of poorer students? Is it to kind of reduce kind of inefficient electricity use? And find kind of the experts in that. And they're just hungry for data. So if you say, well, we have a platform where we're collecting the data anyway, most of these people will be more than happy to work with you for free.
Wow, that's really, really good advice. You mentioned the theory of change, which is also one of the concepts you elaborate on, and that's been obviously quite popular actually in the field. But I actually see still a lot of impact startups not talking much about it, at least not publicly. So again, what would be a lean way for impact startups to get started with really thinking about a theory of change, and how should they be thinking about that from day one?
So I think it's important, and part of the reason is that even if you don't think it's important, a lot of important people do, including the investor class and investor base. It is something I've noticed that comes up a lot in pitch meetings. Both at foundations and at impact investors, they want to know what your theory of change is because it signals that you've really thought about how the business model translates into the social impact. So as part of the book, we have online teaching assets. So it basically has kind of web assets that help guide you through constructing a theory of change and have templates to do it. And so I would just encourage people to use those. It's not a huge time investment. And it's just a great way to get started to say, okay, if I actually had to write down what my theory of change was in a structured way, would I be able to do it? Do I have a full model of how my business is relating to stakeholders? Am I actually going to achieve behavior change that might be required? How would I measure that? All those questions.
And how does that then translate to the impact measurement from if I got my theory of change, translating that into how do I actually make sure that I'm following it?
Yeah, so that's the tricky thing, and I would say that's a lot fewer people are doing that, which is, I think many people have written a theory of change. Now, actually seeing, is it more than a theory, is the big question. And I think kind of one key thing is that it helps really distinguish the outputs and the outcomes. So if you have an RCT or any other measurement device, what the theory of change says is that are you only measuring the outputs or are you also measuring the outcomes? And how would you actually measure those outcomes in a realistic way? So if you go back to my ed tech example, it's really easy to measure how many students are using your product. But if you actually want to say, do these people's lives improve? Are you really going to run a 15-year longitudinal study? Like, no, that's not realistic either. So it actually is a way to say, okay, how do I balance, if you think of a graph with two dimensions, one is what is the relevance of the metric for impact and how easy it is to measure? There's going to be some frontier there. That clearly there's going to be important metrics that we are not going to be able to measure in a reasonable amount of time. On the other hand, there's going to be very simple metrics to collect that actually don't tell you anything about your social impact. So there's going to be these middle ground that's going to be important. And so on the ed tech space, for example, a lot of times assessment is built into the app. So they're not waiting for some assessment that a school agency is doing. They're kind of building in assessments into their app and can see whether students are learning, they're actually improving, they're engaged, etc. And so it's going to be costly for a social startup or enterprise to do that. But if you actually care about social impact, and in my belief, it actually will help you grow in the long run, because if you can take data, you're going to get more and more capital to grow. If you can say, okay, we actually have proof beyond just intuition or extremely lean metrics, I think that is going to be convincing to the investing community.
That's great. How do you actually hold yourself to account to those metrics that you're setting out to solve? Obviously, that goes almost into kind of impact-weighted accounts or impact reporting, or how do you actually communicate your impact in a meaningful way and hold yourself to account both publicly but also maybe into internal governance structures with your board and things like that?
Yeah, I think that's really up to the board. To be honest, I think boards have to really do a better job of that. But part of it is to say in advance what your metrics are going to be that get reported. Because what I've noticed too often is that when they write an impact report at the end of the year, they only report the metrics that make them look good, or they kind of do that. So as much as you can, from a language of RCTs, there's this concept of pre-registration. So in advance of seeing your data, you say, these are what the tables are going to look like. So the advice I would give, if you really want to do it honestly, is to write the impact report in January, but don't have any numbers. And then in December, you just fill the numbers in. Because otherwise, it's going to be very tempting to only report the numbers, which make your enterprise look good.
So it really requires that rigor. I think I've seen had a chat with some investors, and I think some of the maybe not the best startups out there sometimes do it, where they send out investor updates and focus always on the metric that is currently performing the best, while ignoring the ones that are not doing so well, right? So like really kind of going with the flow, always showing positive stuff, but kind of wiping away the stuff that is maybe not as great. And I think this methodology helps with that, like setting out from the beginning, these are the metrics we're optimizing for, and writing the report almost and filling it with numbers at the end. Yeah.
And I would say this is not just kind of the rigorous thing to do. I actually think it's going to be the effective thing to do, because if you can kind of tell funders or foundations or customers or the world, the media, that this is what your procedure is, people will, I think, have more faith. Because they say, hey, we tied our hands, this is what we believe the metrics were important, and we're reporting them transparently. And so then I think even if some of the metrics don't look great, I think people forgive it more, because they say, okay, well, this was a transparent process. As opposed to, the current metrics, I think people do look at them skeptically. So I think kind of the more skepticism you can decrease is not only, I think, the right thing to do, but it's going to be the most effective in growing your enterprise.
Just a really quick break from this episode to let you know a little bit more about our podcast producer and content agency, Content Multiplied. With all the moving pieces of a business, you can't be stuck managing and creating new content all the time. That's why I've started using Myla and her team at Content Multiplied. It's really an all-in-one content management and repurposing solution that can handle all your content needs. Visit them at contentmultiplied.com today. Contentmultiplied.com. Okay, let's get back to the episode. Great, got it. Do you see some best practices or patterns emerge on standardization? Sometimes, like people that are maybe new to the space, they ask me, okay, how do you measure impact? And I always feel like it really depends a lot. Like, obviously there's some best practices that you just shared, but like impact could be so many different things. Like it's impossible to have one metric for all the impact startups and measure them by that, I think. I'd love to hear from you. Do you see frameworks or reporting standards or certain models evolve that seem to become the gold standard that people should follow?
I mean, I think there's so much heterogeneity in the space. I mean, I will. What I'll mention is right now some concepts people have talked about. I'm not saying I personally agree with them because there's a lot of debate around them. But just, I think part of the book is not to put the thumb on the scale and say this is the right thing to do, but just expose people. So one concept that the book talks about, which I think is very controversial, is this idea of additionality. So it was Paul Brest and his co-authors, who's one of the authors of the book, had kind of introduced this idea. And basically the concept is that to define impact, it's not enough to say, okay, like we sequestered this much carbon, but to say this is what the amount of carbon sequestration that goes above and beyond what the market economy would do anyway. That's what his definition is. Because otherwise there's no kind of difference between either impact investing and investing or business and impact business. So an example would be if a carbon neutral data center was the cheapest thing anyway, the concept of additionality would say that's zero impact. Now, I don't know if I agree with that, but that's just something to think about. It also comes up in microfinance a lot. So if this was a loan a standard commercial bank would have made anyway, should you be getting impact credit for that loan? And so the concept of additionality would say no, whereas other people would say, okay, well, for example, in the microfinance space, if you said we moved these many people out of poverty or we allocated this amount of capital to people who make below the poverty level, those would be relevant measures of impact. But there are some microfinance organizations that say just because you make a loan to a poor person doesn't mean that's impact. Because if that person had very high credit rating, they may have had access to that capital anyway. So I'm not taking a stand on that, but these are some of the debates that people have around impact measurement.
Got it. And what do you think is a practical way for entrepreneurs to navigate that? Should they be really diving deep into these debates, or is there an easy way for them to get started with something?
Well, I think the nice thing about the book is that you don't have to be an expert. I think it nicely just exposes you to the vocabulary so that if these issues come up in your pitch meetings, that you've thought about them and that you're willing to defend what your personal view is. And I'm just a big believer that people need to develop their own personal views, because this is very different than the pure for-profit sector. So in pure for-profit investing, it's just a very simple frontier of risk and return. Not simple, it's obviously very complex, but it's two dimensions. Once you add this third dimension of impact, it gets really, really complicated. So for microfinance, I can construct a loan portfolio which maximizes risk and return, right, on that frontier. And I can make a claim, 20% of people were poor who got this, so I'm making an impact on those people. And that's an argument I have to make. But other person could say, hey, you should have compromised on return to increase the percentage of poor people getting the loans to 50%. Now, there's not a right answer to that. But I think understanding risk-return impact frontier, additionality, these concepts will give people the tools that they can argue that they actually are making an impact or that they've balanced returns and impact in the right way.
there's actually a chapter as well talking about best practices of social innovation leaders as well. And I think even broader than that, I'd love you to share maybe some of the lessons learned from some of the best social innovation leaders, especially social impact startups out there that first-time founders can adopt. Like, what are the best practices, not just in terms of impact measurement, but in terms of generally setting up an impactful company? And then maybe which are kind of the mistakes to avoid and the traps that people go into very quickly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think that section of the book, I think, is important because I think there's a lot of leadership content that is really geared towards for-profit entrepreneurship and not really specific to the social sector. So that sector talks about, I think, traits that are unique to social sector entrepreneurs. So one is resilience. It talks a lot about that because the capital market for social enterprises is very different than for traditional for-profit businesses. It's very hard to get venture capital funding. You know, people do get it, but it's very hard because venture capital is looking for unicorns. Because that's their business model. We have to invest in 50 failures to get one unicorn. And so if you don't have any claim to be a unicorn company, like if your market is poor students in an inner city, or the market is poor farmers in Africa, like that's not a unicorn market. And it just takes a lot of resilience to not have easy access to capital. So to be able to kind of fundraise, etc. I would also say another important leadership skill that we talk about in the book is sort of adaptability, which is that how you mix earned revenue and philanthropic capital. And increasingly, I think the most successful leaders understand that earned revenue is really important, not only because it results in sustainability, but also because they spend a lot less time kind of going out in fundraising. So if you just look at the data and how much time is spent, if you have like no earned revenue, you just spend a lot less time on your business. You're just fundraising a lot from capital sources. Now, if you talk about the downsides, I would say that a potential risk area is this mission creep or mission drift. So a lot of people talk about, well, you know, donors can influence organizations in the wrong way. But one thing the book points out is that earned revenue can do the same thing. So if you're kind of obsessed with earned revenue, is that going to lead you to be divergent from your mission? And what are you going to do to keep yourself accountable to make sure that you're not sacrificing mission goals for earned revenue? And I would say that impact investors oftentimes can like lead to mission drift too, or board members if they put pressure in some areas on earned revenue that can compromise the mission.
Sarah Cohen talks about how it's important to really inherently link the profit and the impact and make impact profitable. And you just talked, obviously, sometimes there is a challenge of trading off between profit and impact, where if you're too focused on just the revenue, you may suddenly forget about your impact metrics. I know this is like a pretty common discussion on like people going into the space. So like, profit versus impact. Is it a trade-off, or is it, possible to combine everything? But what's your view on that? Is there an easy way to kind of like aim for what's the ultimate goal for a founder? What should they be aspiring to do, and how should they think of profit versus impact?
So, I mean, Paul Brest's view, which I generally share, is that there is, of course, a trade-off. And if there's not a trade-off, then there's no such thing as social entrepreneurship. It's just entrepreneurship. There's no such thing as impact investing. It's just investing. The whole reason we have these concepts is to understand how to manage this trade-off. And there's not a right or wrong way, because there's several issues that matter to a lot of people. So I'll give an example from a microfinance organization I've studied. And this organization, there was many different possible ways their loan portfolio could have made social impact. So one is on poverty alleviation. So you basically give the loans to the poorest people. So you could have a loan portfolio, and you could calculate how many of these people were the poorest people. A second way you could do it is environmental impact. That some of these farmers had, like, you were investing in kind of good environmental practices that reduce like erosion, runoff, things like that, not using pesticides. And then a third could be gender equity. So you could say, okay, one point of microfinance is to maybe elevate women in the society. And so what percentage of our loans are going to men and women? And then there's the financial trade-off. To claim you could just maximize everything is ludicrous. And I actually teach an exercise using the loan portfolio in my class to show that's impossible using a real life possible loan portfolio. So if you try to maximize environmental impact, you could have 15% of your creditors being women. Is that good? If you maximize financial return, you have only 10% of your people in the lowest poverty level. Is that good? So I think really thoughtful people confront trade-offs. They don't just say they don't exist.
And do you have some examples for businesses that do that particularly well? Is there already some, obviously for a lot of mainstream entrepreneurs, they look up to Amazon and Jeff Bezos and to Google founders and Elon Musk. Elon Musk may be in that space, but like, is there like some role models or examples of companies that do this particularly well?
I think the ones that have scaled really well are just ones to look out for. There's a company that was founded at Stanford, Delight, which did these African solar to kind of, and I think that was a really nice one because it helped the economics of the people in the region, the safety of the people, and the environmental emissions. Kiva, I've always admired that company a lot just because of how much it scales, and that it's not just. So many of these nonprofits are like, oh, okay, like we could reach 100 homeless people, we did one shelter, or we could do like one charter school, and they're just so difficult to scale. I mean, Kiva is just very magnificent because of just how much it scales and having that platform. I think they're definitely role models, and I think part of these great role models is that they kind of really thought about how do I scale impact, not just scale my organization.
Great. Yeah. We had Jessica Jackley, the founder of Kiva, on the podcast a while ago, and she's working on a new startup in the education and charity space actually right now, which is super exciting. And I think it's a great role model, definitely, in terms of Kiva. Just really scaling this space of microloans and access to capital. Absolutely amazing. One more theme that I'm excited to talk about, or I'm interested to talk about a bit more, is do you feel like there's certain sectors within social entrepreneurship that are overhyped, like certain ideas or problems that loads of entrepreneurs seem to want to solve, but it's actually maybe not that impactful, versus what are underhyped spaces and sectors within social entrepreneurship? Do you see like some patterns where like everybody seems to want to solve this one problem, but there's this obvious one that nobody really has interest in? Do you see that?
Yeah, I think kind of a lot of, at least in the U.S., I kind of look at the U.S. a lot and developed economies. I think developing economies could be very different, so I just want to caveat that. But a lot of this is sort of where in the kind of chain of someone's life does something go wrong, right? And so I actually think a very overhyped sector that a lot of money has been poured into, including from Amazon, is ed tech. I think a lot of these things are kind of on the margin. The impact is not measured all that well, and they seem to kind of not address the real systematic issues in education. Whereas I think things that are actually underinvested is in healthcare. I actually think kind of more should be done in that space. And I think a lot of our problems with education, poverty, etc., kind of stem through healthcare issues, especially early in someone's life. And I think that another very underinvested area is housing, because I think that is one of the early aspects of where someone's life can go wrong if they don't have stable housing. So that's just my personal belief, but that's what I've noticed.
Starting with kind of the basic needs in the Maslow pyramid hierarchy of needs, right? Like, which will unlock a lot of more levels for people, right?
I think it's a really nice way to put it. I think there's underinvestments in the base of the Maslow hierarchy and overinvestment in some of the higher parts of the pyramid.
Got it. Amazing. What do you think does the future hold for social innovation and social entrepreneurship? First of all, where do you think things are moving, and where would you like things to move? Is everything moving the right direction, or where are we going in the next, let's say, 10 years?
Well, I think kind of one, as we talk about in the book, this book tries to respond a bit, I always pronounce his name wrong, is Anand Giridhara's book. And I mean, in many ways, that book is basically saying, it's a very strong polemic book, which argues that a lot of people in this space, social innovation, the philanthropists, the impact investors, it's basically saying they're doing the wrong thing. That they're basically kind of using this as a fig leaf to not have the structural reforms needed to really address all these social problems. And I would say that's too extreme. That's like an either-or mentality of the world. But I do agree that social innovators have to sort of embed themselves and connect to the future changes in regulation. So I would say across the world, what governments need to do is, how do we set up regulations in a way that work really nicely with social entrepreneurs? And so you see some of that already with like different organizational forms like B corporations. But I actually think kind of different tax treatments for social companies, non-social companies, is kind of the right approach. So I would say a good future is the one where regulation actually embraces stakeholder capitalism as opposed to go against it. So I'll kind of give you examples. Right now in the US at least, pensions are very heavily regulated. And so they're regulated by something called ERISA rules. And the ERISA rule basically makes it impossible for a pension fund to invest in impact investing. Now, there's been some administrations, like the Obama administration, had a rule that made that easier. Trump reversed that. But that's something the government can do to help, which is if people in pensions want to invest their money in good causes, and if you actually interview a lot of these pension holders, like retired teachers, retired police officers, things like that, they actually feel they don't want their money going to bad ESG causes. So if there's mechanisms by which you can obviate these strict rules, right, the ERISA standards, I think that's the future. Is that it's not like you have the separate world of government regulation and these social entrepreneurs and the foundations, but they're all working together in a productive way.
Is there spaces that you think social entrepreneurs should stay away from because it's too difficult to innovate as a social entrepreneur and it should be left to governments or NGOs, or spaces that are more difficult to solve, especially with profit-driven business models, so to say, like that are better solved in different ways through NGOs or governments?
Well, I think there are sectors where entrepreneurs need to be humble and be respectful of the fact that there's a lot of government regulation and involvement. So I mentioned the healthcare sector earlier. And I mean, the story of Theranos is basically you cannot treat this space like a food delivery app. This lean startup, iteration stuff, it just doesn't work. And I've talked to a lot of people in this biotech space, and it's just a different entrepreneurial mindset where it's way longer exit times. The clinical trials processes are much more complex. There's much bigger valleys of death. And so there are some fields like healthcare, biotechnology, where if you need a long-term mindset for. And so it's not that, obviously we need entrepreneurs working in that space, but we don't want Theranos-like entrepreneurs working in that space.
Especially in these days as we're recording this. So thank you, Neil, for sharing so many lessons. I've learned a lot. I know the audience has learned a lot from this and really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for joining.
Well, thanks so much for having me and all your wonderful questions. It was a terrific discussion.